Okay, so now that Simon has kind of talked through his section, we're going to move on to the tools around managing resources within Azure. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to briefly touch on the Azure Portal. So you've seen it in a couple of demonstrations already, but the Azure Portal is the web-based user interface provided by Microsoft for managing services and resources within the Azure Cloud Platform. It's designed to be the central hub for all Azure-related activities and provides you with a graphical user interface for managing your resources. As it is accessible from the internet, you can access it from any browser, from anywhere. So it's quite a useful tool from that point of view. It provides a way of managing, deploying, and monitoring your resources. The monitoring can be done via customizable dashboards that displays information about any resource that you have access to. Users can also create and manage resources directly from the portal or via tools that allow for scripting or templates. As the portal is a crucial part of Azure and is the sort of linchpin of quite a lot of the management side of things, it is designed to be highly resilient. It has a presence in all the data centers within all regions. So this ensures that if Azure has a full region outage, the portal doesn't. Microsoft's designed it to be always available, ensuring that maintenance and updates can be done continually with no downtime, assuming nothing goes wrong with their testing. Because sometimes it still does go down, but for the most part, it's pretty sort of solid from that point of view. So moving on from the portal, we'll now look at some of the other tools and methods that you can use to manage your resources in Azure. So Azure PowerShell, it's one of the tools that Microsoft provide, and it's used for creating and managing objects via the command line or scripts. So if you want a larger script sort of or set of actions, that's where the scripting comes in. It offers a wide range of commands, or in PowerShell they're called commandlets, and they can be used to create, update, or delete your resources. So the changes that you do within PowerShell can be a single kind of one-off command that's run at the command line, or it can be a large script that can create or tear down a full environment of various resources and resource groups as needed. PowerShell was originally a Windows-only language due to its origins in .NET, which was a Windows-only language. But as .NET has migrated to be platform agnostic with versions supporting on Linux and Mac OS, Azure PowerShell has followed suit. So the more recent iterations are supported on Linux or Mac OS. So that's our Azure PowerShell. So we'll move on to Azure CLI, which is the other command line tool. So Azure CLI, or command line interface, is a tool that provides you a way of managing resources very, very similar to Azure PowerShell. The syntax and commands are different because this was originally based around Linux and Bash scripting rather than Windows and PowerShell scripting. This is due to Azure CLI being the original kind of cross-platform command line. Nowadays, the choice of Azure CLI or PowerShell is more of a user choice rather than a technological choice. It's just which one you're more comfortable with. There are still some cases where one is better than the other. So for me personally, deploying AKS clusters into Azure is far simpler using Azure CLI than it is PowerShell. So sometimes it's not your choice as such, but the choice of the team that's behind that feature within Azure, and they sometimes bring features to one scripting tool before the other. So both PowerShell and Azure CLI can be run from a local machine, so just from your local command line on your machine at home. but it does require kind of installation of applications on your machine. So moving on to the next option is the back one, Simon. Thank you. Is the Cloud Shell. So alongside the Azure Portal, Microsoft also provides the Azure Cloud Shell. So this is a web-based interactive shell provided by Azure. It's like the portal, you can manage your resources from any web browser, but rather than it being a graphical user interface, it is a command line interface. So it supports both Azure CLI and PowerShell. So it's a very powerful tool for managing your resources. The Cloud Shell is just a fully kind of pre-configured environment. So there's no local installation on your machine. You just need the web browser. It comes with all the components and dependencies pre-installed. You can also use local storage within the Cloud Shell, and this is because on the first sort of run or initialization of the Cloud Shell, you can use it to configure with a storage account at the back end. So all your files and any scripts that you might want to create are placed into the storage account. So they're always there for when you want to run it. So those are the sort of the management tools that Azure offer for managing resources within the Azure Cloud platform itself. So if we move on to Azure Arc, so Azure Arc is a service offered by Microsoft, and it enables customers to manage servers, Kubernetes clusters, and other resources that may be on premises, or in other cloud providers' platforms. Its primary purpose is to sort of provide a centralized management plane for these resources. So regardless of where they're located, they all present in the same way. With Azure Arc, customers can use the Azure tools that Simon and Lisa kind of spoke about around policies and alerting to ensure that their resources across different environments are managed in the same way. And so it allows you to extend these kind of Azure compliance frameworks out to other locations. So Azure Arc provides you a single control plane for managing these resources. It does this by projecting the non-Azure resources into Azure Resource Manager, so the management plane behind the Azure Portal and Azure Arc. It simplifies the governance because you have a consistent management across the different hybrid and multi-cloud resources, and you can manage a wide variety of different resources, and more are added like sort of each month. The main ones at the moment, would be other providers, Kubernetes clusters, virtual machines, and database servers. So it's a comprehensive solution for managing your resources if you've got your own data centers, or if you're running something in GCP or AWS. So I briefly mentioned it just then, but behind all of these services is the Azure Resource Manager. So that's the next slide. So Azure Resource Manager, or ARM as it's sometimes called, is the deployment and management service that sits behind all the Azure resources. It's the way you use it to deploy and manage your resources, and it provides a consistent behavior across the different tools and the different ways of interacting with Azure. I briefly mentioned it in last week's section about role-based access, but every request to Azure goes through Azure Resource Manager, and ARM authenticates and authorizes that request. So if you don't have permissions to interact with the resource, then your request gets denied at that point. So it provides a consistent way of interacting and authorizing requests into Azure. ARM also provides the organizational tools, i.e. like the tags that Lisa mentioned, so where you can add these additional bits of information to your resources for cost management or automation functions, like Simon mentioned around Azure policy. So Azure Resource Manager also provides a way of creating resources using templates. So this brings us on to ARM templates. So ARM templates, if my machine would move, there we go. So ARM templates are a way of creating resources within Azure. They use declarative JSON files, which means that sort of it's a file where you give a desired state of what you want the resources to be. So rather than programming specific steps of what you're wanting to create and how you're going to create it, you just specify the end goal, and then Azure takes all the complicated configuration options and issues around kind of trying to do this programmatically off your hands, and you provide just this desired state of where you want to end up, and Azure will run through, once it's verified that the template is valid, and create the resources for you. These templates can be used as part of infrastructure as code, so this ensures that the results are repeatable, and rather than the changes being a manual change within the web UI, it's all done through configuration in code. So it's a way of being consistent and repeatable and reproducible. So you can use the same script to create resources in different environments. For example, development subscriptions, test subscriptions, production environments could all have the same base configuration because you're using the same base template. It's just you're changing the names or you're changing machine sizes sort of between those different environments. There are a number of other infrastructure as code solutions out there. So Terraform is probably one of the well-known third-party solutions because it's got cross-cloud capabilities. And Microsoft also provides Bicep, which is a sort of an additional layer on top of ARM templates to sort of try and make ARM templates a little bit nicer to use because they're not the most intuitive thing at times. For this course, you don't really need to know much about infrastructure as code solutions, but it's good to know that they're kind of out there. So ARM templates, you could create one massive file for all your resources for an environment, but that becomes quite cumbersome and quite hard to manage going forward, and also means that for every deployment you might be going back to square one. So you can also break down templates into smaller, more reusable modules, so you're not reinventing the wheel each time. Alongside the templates, you can actually extend them as well with additional scripting. So sometimes the ARM template doesn't quite do everything it needs to be able to configure everything you want. So you might want to add in additional scripting to allow for additional configuration through a PowerShell script or an Azure CLI kind of script or bash script. So in summary, so moving on to the last slide, the Azure Portal is the web-based UI for managing and deploying your resources. The Cloud Shell is the command line companion of the Azure Portal, so you can run command lines and scripts in a web browser as well. The Azure Cloud Shell supports Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI, and these can also be used for modifying and creating resources. Azure Arc is your centralized service for managing resources and ensuring consistent governance for both Azure and non-Azure resources. So whether they live in Azure, whether they're in an on-premises data center or in another cloud provider. And all of these services are supported by Azure Resource Manager, or ARM, which is the management plane that authenticates and authorizes the requests underneath. Azure Resource Manager also provides the ARM templates, which can be used for infrastructure as code style deployments. So that's sort of my whirlwind tour of the bits and pieces within Azure. What I'll do now, if I can get my mouse to work, is I'll quickly share my screen and just show you the Cloud Shell kind of in action. So hopefully Okay, so this is the Azure Portal. Like I said, you've seen it in previous demonstrations as well. You've got commonly used resources or recently used resources along the top, and you have commonly used links slightly further down. So if you want to look at your subscriptions, your resource groups, or resources. So for this, we're just going to navigate to virtual machines. So for my demonstration on networking, I created a virtual machine. This is now stopped and just sat there, but within the Azure Portal, you can navigate to it and you can see the name, you can see the subscription it's in, what resource groups it's in, and what location. So to activate the Cloud Shell, it's this little icon at the top that just looks like a command prompt, and then this will open up a secondary window. So within the Cloud Shell, you have the option of PowerShell or Bash. So I'll stick with PowerShell to start with. I'll just clear the screen so it's slightly easier to see. So like I was saying, Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI give you the ability to manage and update resources in a very similar way. The syntax is just different. So for all I'm going to do is list the virtual machines that exist. So I'm just going to get AZ-VM, and this will use a PowerShell commandlet to bring back a virtual machine resource. So this virtual machine here is exactly this virtual machine that you're seeing in the portal at the top. I can also do AZ-VM list, which is the Azure CLI equivalent of get AZ-VM, and this brings back, rather than a PowerShell object, it brings back a JSON object. So it's slightly harder to read on the screen, but you can manipulate it in very similar ways. You can see that this is still the same VM. It's got the same name. It's got the same location. You can see who's deployed it, and you can see what resource group it's in. So as I previously mentioned, with the Cloud Shell, you have both Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI. They are completely interchangeable from when it comes to managing resources. It's just down to a personal preference or potentially a ease of use, depending on the use case for deploying and managing the resources that you care about. So that's it, I think, from that side. So any questions before I hand over to Gregor?
Mark, can I ask you a question? For the purposes of the people in the chat and stuff like that who are watching the video and want to do the exam, do you need to know PowerShell and or AZ CLI, or do you just need to know what they are for the exam?
It's just knowing what they are.
Right.
You know, sort of, if you look at the AZ-900 blueprint, quite a lot of what we have described over the last 4 weeks, you just need to describe what that is. You know, sort of, it's not a requirement to use and understand what the commands I've just used are, or the more complicated commands. It's just knowing that there are two different command line tools out there. They both can be accessed through the web browser, through the Cloud Shell, but they all interact with Azure in the same way because of the way they interact with the Azure Resource Manager.